So today I'm going to continue the Introduction to Lutheran Scholastic Philosophy series that I started a while ago. Today is going to be a shorter video, a little less dense, covering the life and writings of Cornelius Martini. Now this, of course, is not exhaustive. I'm relying significantly on secondary sources, most notably The Thing and Method from Ulrich Leinzel, German Scholastic Metaphysics of the 17th Century by Max Wundt, and finally Spanish Jesuitic and German Lutheran Metaphysics of the 17th Century by Ernst Wolter. So unfortunately, we don't have too much about Martini right now in English, either in terms of his actual works, or in terms of secondary sources and people interacting directly with him. Nonetheless, I think we have enough to cover the basics and give us a good picture of Cornelius Martini. So, just a few brief facts about his life. He lived from 1568 through 1621, and he studied at the University of Rostock. University of Rostock, for those who remember, was where David Chytraeus taught, and while there, Cornelius Martini was well acquainted with Chytraeus, at least according to Wundt, as well as being acquainted with Johann Caecilius, a very important humanist. I should have mentioned, of course, but Chytraeus is a very notable Lutheran theologian. I have recorded a video on his Rightly Beginning the Study of Theology, which I highly recommend, and he is also one of the authors of the Formula of Concord. So he is quite a notable figure, and it makes sense that Cornelius Martini would spend a lot of time at that university with such an important professor, and then himself have some influence. After his time at the University of Rostock, he taught at the University of Helmstedt, specifically. He was very popular there, one of the most notable professors, and he was the first Protestant to ever teach metaphysics at a university. He started this in 1597. Prior to that, according to Wundt, we have evidence that he was a professor of logic, and that is quite notable. We'll get back to why that's important, but for now, what he's really known for is specifically that he was the first Protestant to ever teach metaphysics at university. It's not to say that he taught it and then no one had thought of it for another 40 years or something like that. Apparently others around at the time had started teaching, but the general consensus is that he happened to be the first one. So it was being taught in Wittenberg and Altdorf and in Strasbourg, according to Leinzel, but nonetheless, he's considered to be the first to teach metaphysics. Now, what about his actual thought? So looking at him teaching metaphysics, we should start by saying, of course, this was controversial. This was not something that everybody simply accepted, was okay with. So Daniel Hoffman, as I have mentioned in a video about his theory of double truth, how Posevitz responds to him, was very critical of Cornelius Martini doing this. He accused Cornelius Martini of introducing paganism, especially, obviously, that it was Aristotelian philosophy, which was against the wishes of Martin Luther. He even accuses Martini of being influenced specifically by the Jesuits, who were, according to Hoffman, saying that, well, they didn't say that metaphysics was created by the devil, but they themselves were used by the devil to introduce metaphysics, which is a horrible, horrible, horrible study. Now, as we will see, the Jesuits did influence Martini, but I would personally argue they did not teach metaphysics and write metaphysical works specifically because the devil compelled them to. But later in his life, he actually got into a dispute as well with the notable Balthasar Meissner over the use of philosophy, because Meissner was a bit more cautious about the use of philosophy, hence writing a book on sober philosophy, which is actually really good from what we have. There's some really good stuff in there. But he got into a dispute with Meissner on this because he was quite positive about philosophy, even more so than somebody like Meissner. So, with respect to his teachings on metaphysics, he was really, really optimistic about the use of reason to understand God. He saw natural knowledge as something capable of reaching God in its proper mode of knowledge, right? He's not saying that we can reach knowledge of God in the same way that theology does, as though we can reach the truth of the Trinity or that we can reach the truth of the Incarnation entirely on the basis of human reason without revelation. But he would point out that, well, Aristotle was capable of reaching the primary, or the first, I should say, efficient cause by using natural reason. So he was quite positive regarding it. Now, as you can tell from what I just said, he's pretty heavily influenced by Aristotle and the humanists. So looking at his humanist influence, you could say that he was especially influenced by, again, as we see with other Lutherans, Italian Renaissance. He spoke, for example, of man being guided by his intelligence, and that man is this beautiful link between the earthly and the heavenly line of his intellect. So as part of this, he puts a lot of effort, actually, somewhat surprising to me when I first read about it, into the study of knowledge and the nature of knowledge. This was something that was pretty important to a solid amount of Lutherans, especially if you look at somebody like Calov. His Aristotelian influence shows up especially in this comprehensive summary of metaphysics that he has. I don't think he would call it a summary specifically, but compared to other works that came out a little while later, like that by the Reformed author Timpler, this could be considered a summary. Anyway, in that you see him really work not as much with the advanced scholastic categories and distinctions that you'd expect specifically of scholastics, but stuck a lot with Aristotelianism. So Wundt specifically mentions that he spoke of substance and accident, the transcendentals, potency and act, causes, necessity and contingency, all of that stuff which is properly found in Aristotle. And maybe you could say the transcendentals specifically are developed further elsewhere, but at the very least in Aristotelian's Peripatetics. Now, this isn't to say that he was ignorant of scholasticism or was entirely negative towards it. According to Wundt, he actually refers his readers to Aquinas' De Ante et Essentia as well as Cajetan's commentary for discussions of things like, well, essence and existence. So even though he was possibly more influenced by the Aristotelians than somebody like Thomas Aquinas, he nonetheless really liked Aquinas and other scholastics. It's kind of hard to parse, admittedly, through the secondary sources, like what all of his influence would be when you take specifically the scholastics. Some will speak of Martini as saying that Aquinas was this phenomenal philosopher that everyone should read, and then other sources are saying that, well, he was more influenced by like Duns Scotus and by Albert the Great. So take that as you will, but nonetheless, we can say that he was influenced probably by all of them in some way, and of course, notably in Suarez. One of the things that makes Cornelius Martini interesting, and a purely historical note, is that when we talk about Lutheran scholasticism and even Reformed scholasticism, there is a heavy influence from people like Suarez and other Jesuits, but most notably Suarez. And Martini was early on enough where you can see the general thought of his own thought prior to reading Suarez, or the publication and spread of Suarez's Metaphysical Disputations and its use in the universities. Something that really caught my eye, again, is from Wundt in saying that it's not so much, I think this was actually Leinzel, sorry, it's not so much that Martini and others read Suarez and just wholesale adopted everything that he said. It's that a lot of them were reaching similar conclusions as Suarez, and then when he came along and wrote the Metaphysical Disputations, he perhaps put it in such a way that was really useful, and people said, oh, let's use this. So there were some, I suppose you could say, converging beliefs that all aligned coincidentally at the same time, in the same way that you have Newton and Leibniz with calculus, perhaps. That's just an example. Other than that, he was a realist, apparently. I don't see way too much in specifically how he was a realist as opposed to a nominalist, but he was. I'm curious to see what that looked like, but that's what I see. I think it was Levolter who mentioned that. And as for his influence from Suarez, because I have to touch on it, he probably was not as heavily influenced by Suarez as other Lutherans were. He was likely more so an Aristotelian than anything, and kind of an independent thinker. But nonetheless, he follows Suarez in some things. He notably says that metaphysics is the science of real being. That is actually really, really, really important for his controversy with the Ramists, which we'll get back into. And with Suarez, he affirms the analogy of being. But nonetheless, as I said, he's not really bound to Suarez, and he's not even bound to Aristotle. There's a really good statement from Leinzel, where Cornelius, I think he's citing Cornelius Martini directly in saying that, speaking of metaphysics, it is not the opinion of the Stagirite that decides, but the nature of the matter itself. So Martini is really an independent thinker in that way, but nonetheless, you can see that he's influenced. His independence is not so much that he didn't have any reliance or didn't build upon previous thinkers, but we wouldn't strictly say, oh, he was a Peripateic with no influence from outside of that, or he was purely like a Thomist or something like that. No, he really drew on Aristotle, probably most notably, but also on Fonseca, on Suarez, seemingly on Aquinas, Scotus, Albert, and so on, even Averroes and other commentators on Aristotle. A really interesting thing that we should probably end in terms of his pure thought on is that he was really important in the discussion with the Ramists, or the Ramists, however you pronounce it, on logic and metaphysics. So he said that it was his life's mission to defeat Ramism on the nature of logic and metaphysics, because, at least according to him, they conflated the two, that metaphysics was really just a kind of logic, or could be deflated into logic. And this is really important because Martini, even though he was the first Protestant to discuss metaphysics at the university, or teach it, I should say, he was also notable as a logician and as a metaphysician in engaging with the Ramists. Wundt goes as far as to say that he was a very significant force in the victory of Aristotelian logic over that of Ramist logic. So take that as you will. So what we can see out of Martini is he was a very independent, unique, bold thinker who had influence from the Aristotelians, from the Jesuits, from earlier scholastics. Of course, he was a Lutheran because he met Catreus, he met Caecilius, he was teaching as a Lutheran, all of that stuff. And he was quite a combatant in the intellectual side of things. So going after Hoffman, going after Meissner, and so on. And I would say he certainly beat Hoffman, at least in terms of how Hoffman's influence really wasn't that notable thereafter. I cannot say much about him versus Meissner. I think that was a lot harder to decide. I don't think there'd be a clear-cut winner, perhaps. But the final thing we should mention, I believe, is his influence on people after him. Because unfortunately, when we talk about Lutherans and even Lutheran philosophers, we don't talk so much about Cornelius Martini, even though I think we should. So who were some of his notable students? Well, first, Jacob Martini. People are probably more aware of Jacob Martini. From what I have seen, Jacob Martini, I should say, is more influenced by the scholastics than purely an Aristotelian, and he has some pretty notable writings, like his metaphysical exercises and so on, that people are familiar with. So he may have been more influential than Cornelius, and was probably more influenced by Suarez. He also taught Henning Arnisaeus, who was really important with Martini in disputing and really defending the use of metaphysics and the idea that they weren't just entirely dependent upon the Jesuits for their philosophy. Arnisaeus has some really harsh things to say towards Thomas Reid. Not the Thomas Reid of the, I believe, 18th century, but Thomas Reid of their day, who was very critical of them and saying, oh, Henning Arnisaeus and Cornelius Martini, these are just Suarists entirely. They were not happy with that. Notably, this is probably the most well-known figure that he taught among people watching the channel. He taught Johann Gerhard, and Johann Gerhard himself taught metaphysics. And what was he teaching off of? Well, Cornelius Martini's Summary of Metaphysics. So take that as you will. I think Martini is somebody that I'd really like to work with more. I don't know enough about him directly in terms of the primary sources. Everything from the secondary is so interesting. But in terms of the primary sources, I would love to translate a lot of his stuff. I've translated one disputation of his against the Ramists on logic, but as for his lectures on metaphysics, I think that'd be really cool and might actually be really helpful for people just getting into it, because from everything said, he's probably easier to read. He is more dependent on Aristotle than obscure scholastics, and he was there to write something for students who weren't as familiar with the subject. This was not, say, 100 years later, where metaphysics had been so well taught at the university for so long that you were expected to know a lot, and it was so drilled in, so to speak. So with that in mind, thanks so much for watching. I really like doing this series. It's really fun for me. Probably doesn't get as many views as others do, but it's probably my biggest impact, or the thing with which I want to have the most impact, is promoting Lutheran philosophy. Thanks for watching. Bye.
Hey everyone, thanks for watching another Scholastic Lutherans video. If you'd like to support us, you can follow us on Twitter at Gerhard's Ghost, or contribute on Patreon at Scholastic Lutherans. There you'll get access to our Telegram chat and other perks. Links can be found in the description. Subscribe, like, or leave a comment, and have a nice day.